Hey everybody, welcome back to another one in our occasional series on close reading strategies. As a reminder, close reading is second reading, rereading, to figure out, to understand, to examine what it is that makes a text work. Writers write what they write on purpose, and in your second reading, in your close reading, you are asking questions and trying to figure out, okay, what is it that this author is doing on purpose? Today, in this video, I don't know when you're watching it, probably not today, but in this video, we are going to begin to answer the question, what if the text that I am close reading is not a written text? And we're going to begin by looking at political cartoons, because if you've ever been in a social studies class, you have been asked to close read political cartoons. And so today, a strategy for that, right after the theme song. Our strategy for this particular video for looking at political cartoons is an acronym, ISLE. And just because it is an acronym, and well, you know how I feel about acronyms, that doesn't mean that in this case you have to do these in order. In fact, some of these are much easier to begin with, and A in particular can be a little bit tricky. So whereas if you think about sumos, for example, you want to do that in that order because it is leading you purposely around the circle to the last thing. For this one, for ISLE, I want you to think about all of these kind of independently. Obviously, they will all come together to help you write about this, to help you write an analysis. But you don't have to do them in this order. So I said A was tricky because A is analogy. When you're looking at a cartoon, the cartoonist is going to say, hey, this new unfamiliar thing is a lot like this other old familiar thing. That's what an analogy is. An author makes an analogy in order to help you understand something new and different by comparing it to something old and understood. I is for irony. Obviously, because this is a cartoon, and in addition to making a political statement, the cartoonists kind of want to be funny. Irony is often funny. You're going to look for parts of the cartoon that turn out different from what you expect. That's what irony is. Things turning out to be different from, or in particular, the opposite of what you might expect. S is for symbolism. Because this is a visual text instead of a written text, symbolism should be an obvious thing for you to look for. The cartoonist is going to put in a thing that symbolizes what it is that they're making an argument about. L is for labeling. The cartoonists are often very helpful because they will put a label on a thing, and we're going to see that in our first example in a second. And then finally, E for exaggeration. Part of how they make things funny is they may exaggerate the way things look and appear. Every political cartoonist is going to have his or her own particular style of drawing people, for example. So let's take a look at a specific example. Can we get the example up on the screen, please? This is a political cartoon by Rob Rogers. If that name sounds familiar to you, in the summer of 2018, Rob Rogers was fired by the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette for a particular cartoon he did about Donald Trump. This one is clearly not about Donald Trump. In fact, if you look at the copyright date, it's 2014. And so I'm going to point out a couple of things just real quick that you might notice about this image. There's a dialogue balloon. A lot of visual texts will have the dialogue balloons. The dialogue balloon is not labeling, but it is usually a way of getting the author's viewpoint across, either quite literally, the characters in the cartoon are going to say what the cartoonist is thinking, or ironically, which we will see in this cartoon when we get to I in just a moment. But we'll start with A. I like starting with this particular cartoon because the analogy is really, really clear. On the left-hand side, you see that this American, I don't like the idea of NSA spies holding my metadata, is surrounded by all of these satellites that are pointed at him that all say NSA. But then on the right-hand side, they don't say NSA. They say AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, T-Mobile, which are, the names of your mobile phone companies. And then he says, okay, that's better. The analogy is that the NSA the National Security Administration is not significantly different from your phone carrier. The NSA is going to look at your metadata, but the phone carriers are already looking at your metadata. You're already giving so much personal information away. The analogy, here's this new and unfamiliar thing, the NSA. Here's this old and familiar thing, your phone company. So then I think it's pretty easy to latch onto what is ironic about this. The irony is that our guy doesn't want his metadata being looked at by government spies, but when a private corporation is doing it, it's perfectly okay. That's kind of the opposite of what you would expect. If you don't want person A to have your metadata, then why would you want person B to have your metadata? But here the guy doesn't seem to care, and that's kind of ironic. S is for symbolism. So what objects in this particular cartoon might be symbolic? Well, I don't know. Dude's hat, it says USA. Does that mean he's just one person? No. He represents Americans generally. The guy is symbolic himself, but also, of course, the satellites. L for labels, obvious ones. USA on the hat, NSA and the company names on the satellites. And E, exaggeration. Well, I mean, the guy, his face is a little exaggerated, but I think the thing that is most importantly exaggerated in this particular cartoon is the distance between the guy and the satellites, right? It isn't, the satellites are 300 or 400 miles up in low Earth orbit, or geosynchronous orbit, or whatever. It's that they're like right here next to the guy. So the exaggeration of how close these are, Rob Rogers might here be suggesting how dangerous this really is. Now you can put all of that together into a pretty solid close reading analysis. Rob Rogers, the author, the cartoonist, is making an argument about how Americans are really hypocritical or really stupid in their feelings about how much they're being monitored, that they care a lot about the NSA monitoring them, but ironically they don't care if their phone company is monitoring them. So there's a really solid analysis to be made just by looking at the AISLE that we went through for this. Now, I know you might not be convinced. You might be thinking, okay, Bullock, you picked a cartoon because it was a perfect example of how to use ISLE. True. But let's do one more quick example from 2018, just to kind of show that this is going to work, even if imperfectly. Here's a 2018 cartoon from cartoonist Gary Varvel. It says, dinner for two, liberal or conservative section, as this couple has arrived to try to get a table at the restaurant. Now, I said that this would work even imperfectly. Earlier, I said you don't have to start with A. Analogy is often the hardest thing to identify. In addition, you might realize that not everything, or not every cartoon, has all 5 of these. For example, what in this cartoon is labeled? Take another look. I gave you a considerable amount of time there because I wanted you to look and understand nothing. There are no labels. The closest argument you could make that there is a label here is that the maitre d', or the host here at the restaurant, is labeling the two sides of his restaurant, liberal and conservative, the same way American politics, the two sides are liberal and conservative. But that's a real stretch. There is no literal label on the restaurant in the cartoon. However, that totally is the analogy. What Gary Varvel is saying here, I think his argument is that American society has become so divided that we cannot even sit near each other in restaurants. That, if you as somebody who voted for Donald Trump or sitting next to somebody who voted for Barack Obama, there could be conflict. That's how bad American political relations have gotten. So there is this distinct analogy between, and you are probably too young to remember when restaurants allowed smoking, but there is this analogy between you might have different sections in a restaurant, such as smoking and non-smoking, the way that in this cartoon Gary Varvel depicts the restaurant as having a conservative and a liberal section. So, is this cartoon ironic? Maybe. In the same way that there's just no label, the irony isn't particularly strong. If you were going to make an argument that it is ironic, you would argue, well, restaurants don't separate their customers by liberal and conservative. The host never asks what your political persuasion is before they seat you. So I think there you might have an argument for irony, but the other thing, you don't need to say labels and irony about this cartoon in order to make an effective analysis, in order to do an effective analysis, in order to do an effective close reading, because the analogy is strong and the symbolism is strong. The obvious symbol here is the restaurant itself. And if you want to get more specific, the host, the maitre d' of the restaurant, symbolizing the significance in this moment of American culture in 2018, the political divide between liberals and conservatives in the country. This whole experience is a symbol of the divide that we are experiencing in our country. And the exaggeration is obvious. Again, the situation primarily is what's being exaggerated in the same way that the distance between the satellite and the guy's head in the Rob Rogers cartoon is exaggerated. I think here, the size and the scope and the seriousness of the political divide is being exaggerated, because it really isn't true that on a daily basis, the people who voted for Trump and the people who voted for Obama cannot sit next to each other. That isn't happening. There are no fights breaking out in restaurants across America. There aren't chairs being thrown across a McDonald's at somebody of the other. It's not happening. So the situation is being exaggerated. Now, again, without irony and without labels, you are still able to make a strong analysis. You're able to do a very clear, close reading of this cartoon and what Gary Varvel is trying to say about American society. So even imperfectly, AISLE, A-I-S-L-E, really going to get you where you need to go with your analysis of political cartoons, with your close reading of political cartoons. As always, there is a link below to a folder full of these. There's a downloadable printable aisle that you can use. You can also just remember, aisle. You don't have to have it on paper, saving the trees, whatever. Also putting a link to Rob Rogers' website and Gary Varvel's website. You can explore their work. And a really good site that always has up-to-date political cartoons from theweek.com. Anyway, we got two more kinds of visual texts we're going to talk about close reading. I will see you for the next one.